Welcome to Miss Scarlett. Subscribe and don't miss out on Patreon. Have fun! A relentless engine growl cut short, choking in its attempt at revival, releasing a thick smoke screen that permeated the car's confines, sharp enough to sting. The driver watched the smoke settle against the backdrop of a lonely highway, its borders stained by darkness like a smudged painting. "Not again," he groaned, delivering another blow to the impotent steering wheel. In this isolated stretch of road, the skeletal remains of forests and a blackened void where street lamps belonged could offer no solace. Stepping out, the man emerged from his luxurious black sedan, now nothing more than an oversized toy, useless in its playset. Colder than the biting wind that needled through his navy suit, the weight of an unknown foreboding bore down. "Absolutely perfect," he grumbled, staring helplessly at the engine. Mechanical knowledge wasn't his strong suit. Spreadsheets and quarterly projections were more his territory. Checking his phone, David found exactly what he expected in this remote area. No service. The last road sign he remembered passing had indicated some town called Maplewood was about 2 miles ahead. With no other option, David grabbed his briefcase and overnight bag from the trunk. The walk wasn't going to be pleasant in his polished Oxfords, but he didn't have much choice. As he trudged along the highway's edge, the weight of the day settled on his shoulders. The failed business meeting, the client who wouldn't budge, and now this. A broken-down car in the middle of nowhere. An hour later, the lights of a small town appeared. Maplewood turned out to be one of those picture-perfect places that seemed frozen in time. Victorian houses with wraparound porches lined the main street, and a town square complete with a gazebo sat in the center. But at this late hour, everything was closed, except for a single diner with flickering neon lights. The bell above the door jingled as David entered. A few patrons glanced up briefly before returning to their meals. Behind the counter, a woman in her 60s wiped down the surface with methodical strokes.
"Excuse me."
David approached, setting his bags down. "My car broke down a couple miles back. Is there a hotel in town, and maybe a mechanic?" The woman looked him up and down, taking in his rumpled suit and tired expression.
"Hal's Auto is the only mechanic, but he's closed until morning. As for staying, we don't have a hotel proper, just Vivian's place, the Lavender Rose Bed and Breakfast up on Hillcrest Road." She pointed out the window toward a hill overlooking the town. "Can't miss it. Big Victorian with the purple trim. Vivian's a bit different, but she'll have a room for you." "Different how?" David asked. The woman just smiled. "You'll see." Following her directions, David found himself standing before an imposing 3-story Victorian mansion. The porch wrapped around the entire first floor, and every inch of trim was painted in varying shades of purple. Garden gnomes and ceramic animals crowded the front yard in what could only be described as organized chaos. Before he could knock, the door swung open, revealing a woman who matched her house in every way. She wore a flowing caftan in deep purple, her silver hair piled atop her head in an elaborate updo, and at least 5 necklaces dangled from her neck. "I knew someone was coming tonight. The cards told me," she announced by way of greeting. David blinked. "The cards?" "Tarot, young man. Never doubt the cards." She ushered him inside without waiting for a response. "I'm Vivian Rose, and you look like you've had quite the adventure getting here." The interior of the house was just as eclectic as its owner.
Bookshelves overflowed with volumes on every subject imaginable. Crystal prisms hung in windows, casting rainbow patterns across vintage furniture. The smell of incense hung in the air, mingling with something baking in the kitchen.
My car broke down,
David explained, feeling oddly compelled to remove his shoes in this strange woman's home. The diner said you might have a room. Of course I do. The blue room is waiting for you. Vivian led him up a creaking staircase. The universe rarely makes mistakes when sending people my way. The blue room, as it turned out, was aptly named. Everything from the wallpaper to the bedspread was some shade of blue. It was cozy, if somewhat overwhelming to the senses. Bathroom's down the hall. Breakfast is at 8, but I'll have coffee ready by 6. Vivian paused at the door. You look like a man with decisions to make. David set his bag down, too tired to question her cryptic statement.
Thank you, Mrs. Rose. I'll just need to stay until my car is fixed.
Vivian, please, and stay as long as you need. Her eyes twinkled. Sometimes what we think is a breakdown is actually a breakthrough in disguise. After she left, David collapsed onto the bed, too exhausted to even change out of his suit. Tomorrow, he'd call his boss, get the car fixed, and be on his way back to the city. This was just a minor detour, nothing more. Morning arrived with the smell of coffee and cinnamon. David showered quickly in the old-fashioned bathroom, donning the same suit from yesterday with a grimace. He'd need to find somewhere to wash his clothes if the car repairs took more than a day. Downstairs, Vivian bustled around a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a different century. Copper pots hung from a rack, and herbs dried in bunches along one wall. Good morning, sunshine! She set a mug of coffee before him. Sleep well? The spirits in that room are particularly peaceful. David choked slightly on his first sip. Spirits? Just an expression. Vivian winked, though something in her tone suggested otherwise. Now, eat up. Hal's garage opens at 9. Breakfast was surprisingly delicious. Homemade cinnamon rolls and a vegetable frittata that even David, who usually skipped breakfast altogether, couldn't resist. As he ate, Vivian chatted about the town, its history, and the various characters who lived there.
You'll want to talk to Hal about your car,
but fair warning, he moves at his own pace. Time works differently here in Maplewood. David checked his watch.
I really need to get back to the city as soon as possible.
The universe has its own schedule, Vivian replied, with that same mysterious smile. Now, before you go, I have something for you. She disappeared into another room, returning with a small purple stone. Keep this in your pocket. Amethyst, good for clarity of thought. Too polite to refuse, David pocketed the stone and thanked her before heading out to find Hal's auto. The garage sat at the edge of town, a weathered building with vintage gas pumps out front that looked more decorative than functional. Inside, a man in oil-stained overalls worked under the hood of an ancient pickup truck. "Excuse me," David called out. "Are you Hal?" The man straightened, revealing a face weathered by years of sun and work. Gray hair peeked out from under a faded baseball cap.
That's me. What can I do for you?
David explained about his car, and Hal nodded thoughtfully.
Smoke from the engine, you say? Could be a few things. I'll need to tow it in and take a look. How long do you think it'll take to fix?
Hal shrugged, a gesture that David was beginning to recognize as characteristic of this town.
Depends what's wrong. Parts might need ordering. Could be a day. Could be a week. A week?
David's heart sank.
I need to get back to the city. Nearest rental car place is in Bedford, 30 miles away.
Hal offered.
but they don't deliver. You'd need someone to drive you.
David's frustration must have shown on his face because Hal added,
Tell you what, let me tow your car in and take a look. Might not be as bad as you think.
It was the best option available. David gave Hal the location of his car and headed back toward town, already composing the email he'd need to send his boss. The day passed slowly. David found the town's small library and used their computer to contact his office and check emails. His boss was surprisingly understanding about the situation, telling him to take the time he needed to get back safely. By late afternoon, David returned to Hal's garage for an update. The news wasn't good. "Blown head gasket," Hal announced, wiping his hands on a rag.
And that's not all. Found some other issues once I got in there. Timing belt's on its last legs, and your radiator's seen better days.
Can you fix it?
Sure can, but I'll need to order parts. Won't be here until Tuesday at the earliest.
Today was Friday.
So, I'm stuck here until at least the middle of next week.
Hal nodded sympathetically.
Afraid so, unless you can find someone to drive you to Bedford for that rental. But Vivian's place isn't a bad spot to be stranded. Best breakfast in 3 counties.
With resignation settling in his chest, David trudged back to the Lavender Rose. Vivian didn't seem surprised to see him return. "Car troubles more extensive than expected?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer.
Parts won't be in until Tuesday,
David confirmed, slumping into a chair in her kitchen. "I don't suppose you know anyone who could drive me to Bedford tomorrow." Hal mentioned a rental car place. Vivian pursed her lips. "I would, but my car's in the shop too. At Hal's, actually. Has been for 2 weeks now." She patted his hand. "Don't worry. A few days in Maplewood might be exactly what you need."
"I'll need to wash some clothes,"
David said, glancing down at his increasingly rumpled suit.
"Is there a laundromat in town?"
"Of course! I'll show you after dinner. Which reminds me..." Vivian stood, heading toward the stove. "Hope you like vegetable stew. It's my grandmother's recipe." The stew was delicious, and the conversation flowed easily as they ate. Vivian had lived a fascinating life, traveling the world in her youth, working as everything from a fortune teller to a chef before returning to her hometown to open the bed and breakfast. After dinner, David gathered his limited wardrobe, and Vivian led him to the town's small laundromat. As he loaded his clothes into a washing machine, disaster struck. The ancient pipes above the machines chose that moment to burst, sending a cascade of rusty water directly onto the counter where he'd set his clean clothes. "Oh my!" Vivian exclaimed, as David frantically tried to rescue his belongings. But it was too late. Everything was soaked with filthy water. The laundromat owner apologized profusely, promising to pay for replacements, but that didn't solve David's immediate problem. He now had nothing to wear except the clothes on his back. "Well," Vivian said, as they walked back to the bed and breakfast, David carrying a plastic bag of ruined garments. "This is quite the predicament." "Is there a clothing store in town?" David asked, hopefully. "Maplewood Fashion closes at 5, and it's nearly 8 now. They won't open again until Monday. Owner takes weekends off to visit her grandchildren." David ran a hand through his blonde hair in frustration. "What am I supposed to do? I can't wear this suit for 3 more days." Vivian was quiet for a moment as they climbed the steps to her porch. Then her face brightened. "I might have a solution, though it's unconventional." Inside, she led him to a room he hadn't seen before. A bedroom converted into a massive closet. Racks of clothing lined the walls, and plastic storage containers were stacked nearly to the ceiling. My late sister's things, Vivian explained, rifling through a rack. We were about the same size, I'd wager. She was quite tall for a woman. David stared in confusion. You want me to wear women's clothes? Just until the store opens Monday, Vivian reasoned, pulling out items and holding them up against him. No one in town needs to know. It's either this or that suit for 3 more days. The prospect of wearing his increasingly smelly suit was unappealing. But women's clothing? David shook his head. I appreciate the offer, but I can't— Nonsense, Vivian interrupted, pulling out a pair of jeans. These are practically unisex, and this— She held up a simple black sweater. Could be anyone's. No one would even notice. David wavered. The jeans did look fairly normal, and the sweater was plain enough. Just try them, Vivian encouraged. If you hate it, we'll figure something else out. Reluctantly, David took the clothes and retreated to the bathroom. The jeans were snug in places men's jeans usually weren't, but they fit. The sweater was soft and loose, with a wider neck than he was used to, but not obviously feminine. Looking in the mirror, he had to admit that while the cut was different, nothing screamed women's clothing at first glance. When he emerged, Vivian clapped her hands. See? Not so terrible, and far better than wearing that suit until it can stand on its own. David had to agree, though he still felt strange. Thank you. This will work until I can buy something else.
Excellent. Now, let's find you a few more options. You'll need something to sleep in, at the very least.
Before David could protest, Vivian was sorting through more containers, pulling out simple t-shirts, another pair of jeans, and cotton pajamas that, while slightly feminine in cut, weren't covered in flowers or lace. By the time David went to bed that night, he had a small stack of borrowed clothes that would get him through the weekend without drawing too much attention. It was an unusual solution, but as he changed into the soft pajamas, he had to admit they were far more comfortable than sleeping in his underwear or suit pants. The next morning, dressed in the black sweater and jeans, David ventured into town. He felt self-conscious at first, certain everyone would notice he was wearing women's clothing, but as he passed locals on the street, no one gave him a second glance. The town was more lively on Saturday. A small farmer's market had sprung up in the town square, and David found himself browsing the stalls, relaxing as he realized no one was paying any special attention to him. He bought a coffee from a local vendor and sat on a bench, watching the townspeople go about their business. First time in Maplewood? A friendly voice interrupted his thoughts. A woman about his age stood nearby, holding a basket of fresh produce.
Is it that obvious?
David asked, with a small smile. We don't get many new faces, she explained, sitting beside him. I'm Eleanor. I run the bookstore across from the diner.
David,
he replied, then hesitated. Would she notice his clothes? Would she think it strange? But Eleanor just smiled and continued chatting about the town. Their conversation was interrupted when someone called Eleanor's name. She stood, adjusting her basket. It was nice meeting you, David. If you're still in town later, stop by the bookstore. First-time visitors get a free bookmark. As he watched her walk away, David realized he'd been holding his breath, expecting some comment about his appearance. The fact that she hadn't noticed, or hadn't cared, was strangely liberating. Returning to the Lavender Rose for lunch, David found Vivian in the garden, talking to her plants. She brightened when she saw him. How was your morning adventure? I see the clothes are working out.
They are,
David admitted. No one seems to notice. People see what they expect to see, Vivian said wisely.
Now I'm afraid I have some bad news.
I was cleaning your bathroom and accidentally knocked your suit into the tub. It's soaked through." David groaned.
That was my only business outfit.
"I've hung it to dry, but it needs proper cleaning now. The dry cleaner opens Monday." Vivian looked apologetic, but there was something in her expression that made David wonder if the accident had been entirely accidental.
I guess I'm committed to borrowing clothes until then.
He sighed.
Indeed. And I've been thinking, those jeans are practical, but they're not quite right for you. Let me show you some other options.
Before David could object, he found himself back in Vivian's makeshift closet, trying on various outfits. Most were simple, jeans, slacks, sweaters, but Vivian kept encouraging him to try things with a better fit. "These slacks were my sister's favorite for traveling," she said, handing him a pair of black pants. "The fabric has a nice stretch to it." The pants fit surprisingly well, hugging his hips in a way that was unfamiliar but not uncomfortable. The pale blue button-up shirt she paired with them was softer than his usual Oxford cloth, with a slightly more tapered waist. "You see? Much more flattering," Vivian declared when he emerged from the bathroom. "The right cut makes all the difference." David had to admit, the clothes were comfortable, even if the silhouette they created was slightly different from his usual attire. The fabric felt good against his skin, and there was something freeing about wearing clothes that moved with his body rather than constraining it. That evening, Vivian announced they were going out to dinner. "You can't visit Maplewood without trying Maria's cooking at the Foxglove Inn." David hesitated, looking down at his borrowed outfit. "Won't people wonder about my clothes?" "No one in this town knows you're wearing women's clothes unless you tell them," Vivian assured him. "But if you're concerned, we can add a touch of camouflage." She disappeared briefly, returning with a small makeup bag. "Just a bit of tinted moisturizer to even out your complexion. You have a bit of beard shadow coming in." David started to protest, but Vivian was already dabbing cream on his face with expert motions. There, subtle, but effective. The Foxglove Inn turned out to be a charming restaurant in a converted historic home. As they were shown to their table, David felt exposed, certain everyone was staring, but just like at the farmer's market, no one gave him a second glance. "See? Nothing to worry about," Vivian murmured as they sat down. Their server approached with menus. "Good evening. I'm Rachel, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." "Hello, Rachel." Vivian smiled. "This is my friend who's staying at the B&B while her car gets fixed." David froze, heart pounding. Her? Before he could correct the pronoun, Rachel was already speaking. "Car trouble is the worst, but you picked a good weekend to be stranded. The weather's perfect." She handed them menus. "Can I start you ladies with something to drink?" Ladies, plural. Rachel thought he was a woman. David opened his mouth to correct her, but Vivian kicked him gently under the table. "2 glasses of the house red, please," Vivian ordered smoothly. When Rachel left, David hissed,
Why did you let her think I'm a woman?
"What difference does it make?" Vivian shrugged. "It's easier this way. Otherwise, we'd have to explain the clothes, and that would be a whole conversation. This way, you can just relax and enjoy dinner." The logic was twisted, but David was too flustered to argue. Throughout the meal, Rachel continued addressing them as ladies, and each time, David felt a strange mix of embarrassment and something else he couldn't quite identify. As they walked home under the stars, David was quiet, processing the evening. "Penny for your thoughts?" Vivian asked.
I've never been mistaken for a woman before.
he admitted. It was weird. Weird bad or weird interesting? David considered this. Both? Neither? I don't know. Sometimes the universe puts us in unexpected situations to teach us something about ourselves, Vivian said.
The question is, what are you learning?
David had no answer for that. Sunday morning brought a new dilemma. Vivian had planned to attend her weekly book club, and she invited David to join her. They're a lovely group. We're discussing a mystery novel this week. Nothing too heavy. Won't they wonder who I am? Vivian waved dismissively. I'll introduce you as my guest, though it might be simpler if... If what? David prompted when she trailed off. Well, after last night's dinner, I was thinking it might be easier if you went as Danielle. Danielle? It's close to David, easy to remember. Just for the book club. It would avoid any awkward explanations about why you're wearing these clothes. David should have refused immediately. This was crossing a line from borrowing clothes out of necessity to actively pretending to be someone else, someone female. Yet, something made him hesitate. I don't know, Vivian. Just try it for one afternoon, she coaxed. If you hate it, we'll never speak of it again. Somehow, David found himself agreeing. Vivian helped him select an outfit, dark jeans and a soft green sweater that she insisted brought out the gold in his blonde hair. Then she sat him down at her vanity. Just a touch of makeup, she promised. Nothing dramatic. David watched in the mirror as she applied tinted moisturizer, a hint of blush, and a very subtle lip gloss. The changes were minimal, but in combination with the clothes and his growing out hair, the effect was convincing. I have these if you want to complete the look, Vivian said, holding up a pair of small gold hoop earrings. They're clip-ons. David hesitated, then nodded. Why not go all in? It was just for one afternoon, in a town where no one knew him. The clip-ons pinched a bit, but they added the finishing touch to his transformation. Looking in the mirror, David barely recognized himself. The person staring back wasn't entirely female, but wasn't quite male either. Somewhere in the liminal space between genders. What do you think? Vivian asked softly. I look different, David managed, unable to articulate the complex emotions swirling within him. You look lovely, Vivian corrected. Now, shall we go meet the ladies? Danielle? The name hung in the air between them, an invitation to step into another identity, even if just for a few hours. David took a deep breath and nodded. Let's go. The book club met in the back room of Eleanor's bookstore. As they entered, David, now Danielle, felt a flutter of panic. Eleanor had met him yesterday as David. Would she recognize him? But when Vivian made the introductions, Eleanor showed no sign of connecting this person with the man she'd met at the farmer's market. Danielle is staying at my place while her car gets fixed, Vivian explained to the group of 5 women seated around a table with tea and cookies. Welcome, Danielle, a woman with curly gray hair greeted warmly. I'm Martha. We're always happy to have new perspectives. As the discussion began, David, Danielle, mostly listened, afraid that speaking too much might give away the ruse. But gradually, as the conversation flowed around the mystery novel's twists and turns, he found himself drawn in.
I think the sister had more motive than anyone is acknowledging,
he offered at one point, his voice softer than usual. The group considered this, nodding thoughtfully. That's an interesting perspective, Danielle, Eleanor said. I hadn't thought about it that way. The approval, the acceptance, the simple act of being included in this circle of women discussing literature. It all created a warm feeling in David's chest. For those 2 hours, he wasn't a financial analyst with a broken-down car and a missed meeting. He was Danielle, book club participant with insights to share. After the meeting, as they walked back to the Lavender Rose, Vivian asked, "How was it?"
Strange,
David admitted.
but not in a bad way. No one suspected anything.
Of course not. You were just being yourself. A slightly different version, perhaps, but still you. That night, as David removed the clip-on earrings and washed the subtle makeup from his face, he stared at his reflection. Who was he, really? David, the financial analyst who lived by schedules and spreadsheets? Or could there be space for Danielle, too? Someone softer, more reflective, more comfortable in her skin. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like opening a door he hadn't known existed. Monday morning arrived with rain pattering against the windows. David dressed in the now familiar, borrowed clothes, black slacks and a cream-colored blouse that Vivian insisted was unisex enough. He needed to check on his car and visit the clothing store to buy some proper men's clothes. At Hal's garage, the news was frustrating but not surprising.
Parts are delayed,
Hal explained, gesturing to the partially disassembled engine of David's sedan. Supplier says Wednesday now. Maybe Thursday. David sighed. You're sure there's no way to get it done sooner?
Can't put it together without parts,
Hal said simply.
Sorry about that. Car repairs like baking a cake. Can't rush it if you want it done right.
Next stop was Maplewood Fashion, the town's only clothing store. David pushed open the door, bell jingling above him, and immediately felt out of place. The store was small, with racks of clothing divided into clearly marked sections: men's, women's, and children's. The men's section was disappointingly limited: a few basic shirts, some work pants, and exactly 2 styles of casual shoes. As David browsed the meager selection, the shopkeeper approached, an older woman with a tape measure draped around her neck. "Can I help you find something?" she asked.
I need some clothes, David explained. My luggage was damaged, and I'm stuck in town for a few days.
The woman glanced at what he was wearing, then back at the men's section he was browsing. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. "Men's clothes?" she clarified, her tone slightly puzzled. David felt heat rise in his cheeks. Did she somehow know he was wearing women's clothing? Could she tell just by looking?
Yes,
he stammered. The woman's expression cleared. "Oh, shopping for your husband or boyfriend?" The assumption hit David like a physical blow. She thought he was a woman shopping for a man in her life. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again.
Actually, they're for me,
he said finally. Now the confusion returned to the shopkeeper's face, more pronounced this time. She looked him up and down, taking in the slacks, the blouse, the softened features courtesy of Vivian's tinted moisturizer, which he'd applied himself this morning, telling himself it was just to maintain consistency.
For you?
She repeated slowly. In that moment, David faced a choice. He could explain the whole bizarre situation: the broken-down car, the ruined clothes, borrowing from Vivian's sister's wardrobe. Or he could take the path of least resistance.
Yes,
he heard himself say.
I usually wear women's clothes, but I wanted to try something different.
The lie came easily, surprising him. The shopkeeper's expression immediately shifted from confusion to understanding.
Ah, I see. Well, our men's section is limited, as you can see, but I'm happy to help you find something that might work.
20 minutes later, David left the store empty-handed, having made excuses about needing to think about the options. The truth was, none of the men's clothes had appealed to him. They seemed stiff and boxy compared to what he'd been wearing for the past 3 days. Instead of returning to Vivian's, David found himself wandering into Eleanor's bookstore. The familiar scent of paper and coffee greeted him as he pushed open the door. Eleanor looked up from the counter and smiled in recognition. "Danielle! Nice to see you again. Did you enjoy the book club?" Danielle. She had remembered him as Danielle from the book club, not as David from the farmer's market. The realization should have bothered him, but instead it felt like permission to explore this new identity, to lean into the comfort he was finding in these borrowed clothes and this borrowed name.
"I did,"
he replied, his voice naturally falling into the softer register he had used yesterday.
"I was hoping you might recommend another mystery, something similar to the one you discussed."
Eleanor brightened and led him to a display of books. As they chatted about authors and plot lines, David felt himself relaxing, settling into Danielle's skin. It was strange how natural it felt, how the awkwardness that had initially accompanied wearing women's clothes had faded into something approaching comfort. He left with 2 mystery novels and an invitation to coffee the following day. Eleanor had been so warm, so genuinely interested in his thoughts on books, that declining hadn't seemed an option. The fact that she knew him only as Danielle didn't feel like a deception anymore. It felt like an opportunity. Back at the Lavender Rose, Vivian was in the kitchen baking something that filled the house with the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg. "Any luck with clothes shopping?" she asked, as David set his book purchases on the table. "Not really. The selection was limited." Vivian nodded understandingly. "Small town limitations, but you seem to be managing just fine with what you have." David hesitated, then confessed, "The shopkeeper thought I was a woman, and I didn't correct her." Instead of surprise, Vivian simply smiled. "And how did that feel?"
Easier than I expected,
David admitted.
"Everyone in town now knows me as Danielle. Even Eleanor from the bookstore didn't recognize me from when we met on Saturday."
"Sometimes we need to step outside our usual lives to discover parts of ourselves we've been hiding," Vivian said, removing a tray of scones from the oven. "Care for a scone while they're hot?" As they sat at the kitchen table, warm scones and tea between them, David found himself opening up about feelings he'd barely acknowledged to himself. How restrictive his life in the city sometimes felt, how the rigid expectations of his job and relationships had left little room for self-exploration.
Since arriving here, even with all the inconveniences, I've felt freer somehow,
he confessed. Being Danielle, even just for book club or shopping, it's like I can breathe differently. Vivian listened without judgment, occasionally nodding. When David finally ran out of words, she reached across the table and patted his hand. "The universe rarely makes mistakes when it breaks down our cars in exactly the right places," she said with a wink. Tuesday and Wednesday passed in a similar fashion. David, or rather Danielle, had coffee with Eleanor, browsed the local shops, and even attended a community pottery class that Vivian insisted was just the thing for stress relief. Each interaction as Danielle felt more natural than the last. Each day in feminine attire, more comfortable. On Wednesday evening, Hal called with news about the car. "Parts came in. Should have her running by tomorrow afternoon." The news should have brought relief. Instead, David felt a strange reluctance. Going back meant returning to his old life,
his old self. The thought of putting on his suit again, of stepping back into David's rigid routines and expectations, felt constricting. At dinner, he shared the update with Vivian. "So you'll be leaving us tomorrow," she said, a hint of sadness in her voice.
"It seems so,"
David replied, pushing food around his plate. "Unless—" He looked up. "Unless what?" "Unless you're not ready to leave yet." Vivian's gaze was steady, knowing. "Car's fixed doesn't mean you have to go immediately." The suggestion hung between them, tantalizing in its simplicity. He could stay longer. There was no pressing reason to return to the city right away. His boss had given him the time. His apartment would still be there. His life could wait a few more days.
"I could take a few extra days,"
David agreed slowly. To figure things out." Vivian beamed. "Excellent. And tomorrow night is the monthly town social at the community center. Perfect timing." The social turned out to be a casual affair. Tables of food, a local band playing soft music, townspeople mingling and catching up. David, fully embracing Danielle for the evening, wore a simple navy dress that Vivian had produced from her sister's collection, paired with a cardigan and flats. "You look lovely," Vivian assured him as they entered the community center. "Natural." And surprisingly, that's how it felt. As the band played a slow song, Eleanor approached with a smile. "Would you like to dance?" she asked. Danielle, beaming, accepted, and together they stepped onto the dance floor, joining a swirl of couples under the moonlight. It was a perfect summer night, the air warm and fragrant. Danielle closed his eyes, feeling the gentle breeze and taking in the music around him. And so, as the song came to an end, Danielle knew this was the beginning of something special. Finally, he had found the courage to be himself.
Thanks for watching my girlies! Be sure to check out Patreon for more!